This lecture introduces the audience to philosophical ethics and to the questions of ethics raised by HIV/AIDS. What ethical obligations does the suffering of others impose on us? Are wealthy nations morally required to support poorer nations when human catastrophes happen, whether in the form of natural disasters or epidemics like AIDS? Given the vocal criticisms of the recent U.S. decision to reduce funding of efforts to combat HIV/AIDS in South Africa, the country most severely afflicted by the epidemic, such questions are as relevant as ever. While I cannot treat it thoroughly here, a few words about the history of South Africa are essential. The Republic of South Africa has been shaped by apartheid, literally meaning apartness, developed and enforced over the course of the 20th century by the descendants of European colonists in an attempt to ensure white supremacy. Colonized by both the Dutch and the English as early as the 17th century, the southern tip of Africa developed into an ethnically complex area with new African ethnicities emerging throughout the 19th century and other ethnic groups from India and Malaysia arriving as indentured servants or merchants. The colonial period and the contests between Dutch colonists and British colonial power for control came to an end by 1910 when South Africa emerged as an independent nation. One of its first moves was to deprive black Africans of the right to purchase property in white areas, approximately 87% of the land. Nor were black Africans allowed the vote. Apartheid, the campaign slogan of the National Party, which remained in power from the elections of 1948 until 1994, was said to be necessary to preserve the purity of each of the races in South Africa by classifying each citizen according to race and establishing ethnic homelands for them. Thus, so-called Bantustans were created and given their own administrations to keep other races and ethnicities from mixing with the white descendants of European colonists. Apartheid was intended to secure white rule and property in a rapidly changing context while making inexpensive black African, colored, and Indian labor available for industry and agriculture. The mineral wealth of South Africa led to an early need for cheap, unskilled labor to work in the gold and diamond mines that not only made their owners wealthy, but also enabled the development and modernization of South Africa itself. Thus, the government required black Africans to keep a reference book with them at all times, attesting to their racial group, homeland, and work history, so as to better control the labor force. Much physical violence was also deployed by the government and private militias in order to support the apartheid state, perhaps most famously in the Sharpeville Massacre, depicted in this painting that now hangs in the South African Embassy in England. In 1960, many black Africans were protesting the state's restriction of their movements with these reference books. For the most part, the police were content to beat protesters into submission, but at Sharpeville, the police fired into a crowd of 5,000 men, women, and children, killing 69 people and wounding 180. But this is only one instance of the daily violence used to keep black Africans, coloreds, and Indians politically, economically, and socially subordinate to whites. The government's tactics also included the imprisonment of black leaders who attempted to oppose the apartheid system, whether peacefully or not. Included here is the most famous of South Africans, Nelson Mandela, one of the founders of the African National Congress, who spent 27 years in prison before being released in 1990, eventually to become President of the Republic in 1994, ending decades of apartheid. Mandela's deputy president, Thabo Mbeki, would become president himself in 1999, being re-elected again in 2004 with even greater support, serving until 2009. If 1994 was a euphoric year for the majority of South Africans, it was not long until AIDS, despite early trends suggesting otherwise, it was not long until AIDS achieved epidemic proportions in South Africa. It has been said by South Africans that AIDS has become the new apartheid, showing a clear connection between history and the present. By 2003, nearly 22% of the population between ages 15 and 45 was HIV positive or had AIDS. Over 1,000 people were dying of the disease daily. Average life expectancy had declined from the age of 62 in 1993 to 48 by 2003, and roughly 25% of all male deaths were due to AIDS. Nearly 30% of all female deaths were due to AIDS. Many children were being born HIV positive. only to be orphaned shortly thereafter. South Africa, in short, had been devastated by AIDS. And it is in this context that calls have been and continue to be made for international financial support. So, what do advocates of financial aid for Africa argue about the ethics of AIDS? One typical account of the ethical problem posed by HIV/AIDS has been voiced by AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, better known as ACT UP, formed in New York City in 1987. The group was most famous for its vociferous demonstrations arguing that all needed to be included in experimental treatments so that everyone, including homosexuals and IV drug users, might have the opportunity to benefit from these treatments. One refrain heard over and over from members of ACT UP was that the number one priority should be getting drugs into bodies. As poorer nations around the world, not only in Africa, have suffered and are suffering tremendously from HIV/AIDS, many activists continue to argue that the problem is to be solved by getting drugs into bodies. Thus, there has been a push, eventually adopted by pharmaceutical companies as well, a push to lower the prices of expensive therapies so that they become more affordable to poor people and poor nations. Activists have often criticized pharmaceutical companies for being driven by profit, thus making these companies the main target of their critique. Interestingly, though, these activists agree with the pharmaceutical companies that the focus should be on the drugs, that drugs are the solution to the problem. And this leads to a curious situation in which there is a disagreement based on a prior agreement. Pharmaceuticals work to help people live with HIV/AIDS, and the disagreement only concerns then the extent to which poor people should have access to drugs that are normally very expensive. For many activists, Big Pharma is driven to act unethically because of the profit motive. The ethical thing to do is simply to provide the drugs to all who need them. Indeed, this is one of the major reasons why international financial aid is found to be so important, as can be seen in the World Health Organization's recent pleas for more aid. In what follows, I show why we might want to question or at least complicate this account of the ethical issue. But before we consider the ethics of HIV/AIDS, what is ethics? It's an important question. The study of ethics is generally recognized to be the study and evaluation of the principles that guide human action and shape human character in an effort to distinguish right from wrong in an endeavor to live the good life. Various approaches to ethics have been developed over the past 2,500 years. Some of the most famous are Aristotle's virtue ethics, Kant's deontology, Mill's utilitarianism, and more recently, the ethics of care. Ethics emerged first as the study of character, that is, the sorts of qualities that a person of excellent character would have. Philosophers such as Aristotle gave accounts of the excellent or virtuous person so that people would better know how to live the good life. Ethics has since been reformulated by Kant to avoid making character judgments by focusing on universal duties that humans have to ourselves and others, or it's been reformulated by utilitarians who focus on the consequences of actions for all affected by them. Others have more recently focused not on universal principles, but the importance of particular human relationships for living a good life, such as the relationship of a mother to a child, a teacher to a student. And so it has been argued that principles on their own do not allow specific guidance about how we should act, while relationships of care do. We could also consider approaches to ethics explicitly fashioned for decision-making in a healthcare context where we are confronted with ethical problems that have recently emerged, such as medical experimentation on humans, organ transplantation, and questions about the beginning and end of life. Thus, a thorough consideration of the ethics of AIDS would demand that we approach the problems associated with healthcare and AIDS from each of these approaches to ethics. And, famously, there are discussions about the difficulties and failures of these positions, leading more than one student of ethics to despair of ever finding answers. Yet these different philosophical positions all share a fundamental feature that provides a way into the difficult discussions evoked by questions of AIDS care. So I want to introduce you to the work of ethics, understood in its broadest sense, so as to provide some insight into the sorts of questions that need to be asked and addressed in order to deal with the problems posed by AIDS, considered as a world problem, not just one for particular nations or peoples. For each of the above philosophical positions, as much as they might disagree about what makes an action wrong or right, a life good or bad, each asserts the value of rational discourse for philosophical ethics. I use the phrase rational discourse here in its broadest possible sense as speech or writing that appeals to reasons, whatever these may be. It appeals to reasons in order to justify itself. Ethics, then, asserts that language and reasons matter and appeals to these in order to evaluate, critique, and revise particular claims. Whether participants in the discussion agree or disagree about particular points, however the discussion might be going in this event at Cape Town's Africa Center, it is assumed that each is willing to consider the extent to which any point or position makes sense. And if a position is shown to have problems, each aspires to abandon or correct it in order to hold a reasonable position, one that others can agree to on the basis of its reasons. The real challenge of ethics is to consistently maintain such an approach, especially when confronted with alternative conceptions of what counts as a reason. To engage in ethical discourse is to attempt to persuade others rationally and to subject oneself to revising one's own claims in the face of better reasons or more adequate language. So in what follows, I would like to illustrate this fundamental challenge of ethics by considering the scandal provoked by President Thabo Mbeki regarding HIV/AIDS. Against demands that the government distribute medicines to its citizens, Mbeki famously questioned the causal link between the virus and the syndrome, arguing that poverty causes AIDS. Many commentators in the United States or Western Europe argued that Mbeki had become an AIDS denialist and was causing the needless suffering and death of thousands and thousands of South African citizens. For Mbeki's government had invited scientists known to question whether HIV causes AIDS. His government had invited these scientists as participants in a discussion of HIV and AIDS with mainstream researchers in May and July of 2000. In the end, Mbeki's government waited until 2004 to begin providing antiretroviral drugs to citizens in need. His government questioned whether drug treatment was the solution to the problem, and as a result, was condemned nearly universally in the US and Western Europe. One of his government's health ministers even proclaimed, infamously, that the African potato was better treatment for HIV/AIDS than any Western medicine. Indeed, a 2008 Harvard study blames Mbeki's government for the deaths of 365,000 people. Can there be any doubt that we must condemn Mbeki and his government for inflicting so much suffering? What the scandal surrounding Mbeki shows, I argue, is the danger of assuming that one's own reasons are the only reasons possible. For what we miss out on is the possibility of envisioning other ways of acting that might help address this pandemic. As we saw above, AIDS activists tend to view the pharmaceuticals developed by contemporary medical sciences as the solution to the problem of AIDS, a view supported by the experience of early AIDS victims in the US, who after being near death, quickly returned to normal lives thanks to the first antiretroviral drug treatments. But in post-apartheid Africa, the majority of black citizens viewed scientific medicine with great suspicion as a result of the role it played during the apartheid era. Indeed, some white military scientists and medical doctors had discussed finding ways to infect the black population with HIV/AIDS at the very end of this era in one final effort to establish racial dominance once and for all. So the prevalence of conspiracy theories about Western medicine as a way to kill black South Africans actually did correspond to the historical reality of apartheid. Even so, experimental AIDS drugs had been adopted in South Africa early on, but proved to be quite dangerous, eventually being pulled from the market when it was discovered that the FDA did not approve the same drug for use in the United States because of its dangers to the patient. The demands of foreigners that drugs must be given to all afflicted were heard in this context, perhaps partially explaining the popularity of Mbeki during this period, eventually leading to his re-election in 2004. While Mbeki did not deny that medicine could be effective, he clearly sought alternative approaches to dealing with HIV/AIDS, such as addressing poverty and other social conditions, approaches that epidemiologists also recognize as important modes of intervention. Yet few of his scandalized critics would recognize this, focused as they were on his government's reticence to provide drugs to all citizens. Knowledge of the historical experience of apartheid was vital in the endeavor to persuade Black South Africans of the value of antiretroviral drugs. But the situation also shows that there is a problem with expecting the solution to HIV and AIDS from scientific medicine. The presentation of access to pharmaceuticals as the only ethical issue led to public outcry and outrage among activists, physicians, and scientists when faced with Mbeki's reticence. It also shows that many living in North America and Europe today have difficulty calling the discourses of scientists and physicians, especially when it comes to pharmaceuticals, into question. People here find it hard to question the authority of biomedicine or to consider whether scientific truth alone is enough to resolve human problems. If ethics is not a matter primarily of making judgments, but of seeking to live well, then it is essential to subject one's own highest values and beliefs to question. Only on such a basis might it then be possible to listen to others, to hear the history, experiences, and problems in their own words. Questioning one's own beliefs does not require one to regard any action whatsoever, any kind of life whatsoever, as ethical. Rather, it is to recognize that all reasons are subject to scrutiny, beginning with one's own. We can also say that this is what makes science possible in the first place, since any science proceeds by testing and rectifying its own claims. But since science is one activity among many human activities, we must also learn to question the value of its truths. Talking, then, when it is directed towards the sharing of experience and the discovery and testing of reasons for particular actions or ways of living, is not a fruitless enterprise, but the very condition of working towards the good life. Regarding the ethics of AIDS, the lesson for now is that there is no singular solution to the global human problem. Even if a cure were to be found, even if an AIDS-free generation were to be born, the dead would still exist, and the ravages of the disease on populations around the world would still be present, together with the changes that AIDS has produced in how people live. AIDS and HIV are not merely a disease of the organism, but rather an ethical, social, and political problem. If they raise questions about our obligations to care for others who are suffering, they also urge us to inquire into our deepest convictions and highest values as we seek to live as well as possible.